Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to the third edition of the seminar series on Sephardi modernity, co-sponsored by the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University and the Bellsberg Program for Israel Studies at the University of Calgary. The title of this year's series is The Future of Our Histories, Recollecting the Past, Projecting the Future, and it is co-organized by Angie Cohen and myself, Yuval Ivri. The theme of this year's seminar is the scholarly frameworks from which to approach the diversity of Sephardi experiences of modernization and the social, political, and cultural implication of such frameworks. This year, we want to explore the multiple identities at play in the experiences of modernity and to rethink the disciplinary separation that inform our approaches to identity, history, and culture. As usual, we will summarize the argument placed before us by our participants and their connection with one another. In our last meeting, Lital Belinko-Saba spoke about Judeo-Spanish tales and proverbs, emphasizing the importance of crossing linguistic, literary, and folklore research methods in order to understand how we interpret these narratives in the absence of audio and video recordings. She referred to the nostalgic use of these proverbs and the feeling of loss among speakers and researchers due to the lack of proper recording, which in turn speaks to our limitation to fully understand these pieces of our collective past. Her talk zoomed into the case of proverbs and tales in order to make a more general point about the mediated nature of our relationship with our past. In this sense, Belinko-Saba's talk connected to Yoram Metal's point about the nostalgia of the Jews, for the Jews and their absence in today's Egypt as related to the present political and social reality of the country, and more specifically to the Arab Spring of 2011. In turn, Metal's lecture gave continuity to some of the topics laid out by Ella Shochat in her dialogue with me, the function of multiple origins in the context of certain histories. Today, we have a great pleasure to welcoming Dr. Aviad Moreno from the Ben-Gurion University of the Negev in conversation with our own Angie Cohen. So before we start, let me remind you that the seminar will be structured as usual, 45 minutes of presentation and half of hour of Q&A. Roy Shukron was kind enough to help us moderating the chat. So you are welcome to write your question there. In some wishes, if someone wishes to open the microphone and ask their question, you are more than welcome. Just make sure to let Roy know and on the chat and wait for your turn. So Angie and Aviad, the floor is yours. I'm so excited you are for your conversation.
Thank you so much, Yuval, for the introduction. And I am very, very happy to be introducing Aviad Moreno today, who I consider not only a colleague, but a very good friend with whom I've been lucky to share work and passions since we were both PhD students. So I will now introduce Aviad, and we will start our dialogue. Aviad Moreno is a faculty member at the Ben-Gurion Research Institute at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, where he also heads the research hub Communities and Mobilities at the Azrieli Center for Israel Studies. He's co-editor of The Long History of Mizrahim, New Directions in the Study of Jews from Islamic Countries, from Ben-Gurion University Press in 2021. He's author of Entwined Homelands, Empowered Diasporas, Hispanic Moroccan Jews and Their Globalizing Community, which is forthcoming in Indiana University Press. And he's also the author of Europe from Morocco, The Minutes of Tangiers Jewish Community Council, edited by Ben-Zvi Institute in 2015. Moreno serves on the board of the National Academy for Ladino, the Content Committee of the Museum of the Jewish People, formerly Beit Atfutzot, and the Institute of for the Study of Jewish Press and Communications. He's a co-founder of the Center for Research of Northern Moroccan Jewry in Morocco. And recently, he has been nominated as an international member of the Spanish Royal Academy. I will start with my first question for Aviad, and that's how we will start our dialogue. So Aviad, the main goal of this seminar series is to create a space to discuss the meaning of modernity in the Sephardi world, in the widest possible sense of the word Sephardi, and the phenomena that have been affected by it, such as traditions, languages, knowledges, etc., as well as the relationship between Jews and the non-Jewish world. One key topic of your research is the formation of ethnic groups, particularly in the context of migration. Maybe you could start by explaining how you look at the question of ethnic formation and what you mean by tradition and modernity, quote unquote, being on the move.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you, Angie and Yuval. I truly admire you for creating this platform and intellectual network and for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I find it very illuminating in so many ways. And thank you, Angie, for the question. I'd like to respond with a reference to an offhand remark made during one of my very first interviews I conducted back in 2009 as a doctoral student. The woman I interviewed immigrated to Israel in the 80s from Tangier after previously immigrating to France in the 1970s. And she told me something like this: only in Israel did I become interested in our Moroccan traditions while meeting people. But in Tangier, I used to feel much more French, Spanish most of the time, meaning she wasn't feeling Jewish enough. And as a student, I was really caught off guard by the implication of this remark. That it was only in Israel that she became very proactive in preserving Jewish Moroccan traditions, and she felt Moroccan. It really contrasted it with long-held ideas in Israel, but also elsewhere, about Sephardi traditions as essential characteristics of groups and of modernity as a challenge or something that had to be accommodated, as we often hear in this kind of speech. So this approach was really embedded, in long-held Eurocentric concept that modernity and tradition engage in some kind of linear relationships, that modernity replaces traditions. But this interviewee stressed how tradition developed after a modern experience in Morocco and then in France, and in response to it, and in very specific places and times. And again, it really struck me. And then I found myself reading some work about this. For instance, one of the first works I came across was by the Norwegian anthropologist Frederick Ball, who developed this concept of situational ethnicity, where he argued in his very first formative works that ethnicity or ethnic identities or traditions really emerge in context, right? Such as when people meet in synagogues during Saturday, for instance, in a way that gives meaning or imbues the ethnic backgrounds with a meaning in a very different form that it would actually, happen in the workplace shared with non-Muslims during weekdays, for instance, right? That's something that we can all relate to as people moving. And that means that modernity is the context in which traditions are really created as concepts, or to use, more, simple words. Before people actually began talking about the threat of modernity on their traditional lives, this is how I see it, they did not need to defend or even define those traditional lives and, as something that represent their past. There was something else from what we know after modernity also became a context or contextual representation of their identities, because there were just, concepts that people learned to describe, used to describe their different experience, social interactions, imagined presence, and so on and so forth. So just to sum up in a sentence, or to use a more academic language, traditions and modernity are dialectical, relational, dynamic, and constantly evolving in response to one another. That's how I see the things. Okay. I hope that clarifies.
Also, I think that the past tends to become acquires a different value once that life is in danger, and it becomes a heritage. And for it to become a heritage, it needs to be ritualized. It needs to become a practice. One needs to be intentional about it. So I think that this shift to tradition and preservation happens only when this past starts being in danger, and then traditions and other ritualizing forms helps preserve it in ways that spontaneity wouldn't allow to do so.
Yeah,
I think. So when we look at Moroccan Jews together with so many other Sephardi communities, one fundamental experience is their education in the schools of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, with its universalizing ethos and its project of providing a French education with this assumption that to be modern is to be French. How do you think that the Spanish-Moroccan case, the case of the former Spanish zone in northern Morocco, can contribute to the study of the Sephardic experiences of modernity, or of Sephardi modernities in plural, as we like to say in this seminar?
Yeah, so my point is that it was exactly, there was a demographic and cultural and political development of intensifying colonial encounters that actually changed the way Jews redefine their tradition in specific contexts. So northern Morocco was one of the most prominent hubs of European influence until it was replaced by Casablanca. It was where the Alliance Israélite Universelle schools first struck ground in the entire world. By 1955, for instance, 60,000 Europeans lived in Tangier, no less than 40% of the entire population. So obviously this shift affected the lives of Jews in so many ways. I can talk about their dwelling codes, about the way they, changed their form of speech. But part of this change, and this is my point, was also manifested by what we define today as Sephardi traditions in the making. Let's take, for example, the linguistics, aspect. So what I want to say that, let's take, for instance, the changes in the form of speech, the common language spoken among Sephardic population in northern Morocco, which, there was a local vernacular we all know, and I'm quite sure that people in the room know, called Haketia. Its morphology and vast vocabulary was based on Spanish etymology, combined with Arabic and Hebrew words, but this is exactly what brought about a new discourse about heritage preserving in Morocco already in the 20th century. Some enthusiastic individual, for instance, in the community sought to salvage Haketia, if not to actually revitalize it along with an imagined past in Iberia, for instance, to imbue their Hispanization by colonialism or by the encounter with Spaniards with a new Jewish communal meaning. And that was, I think, the practices were very modern, so to speak. One instance was the work by Sarita Naon, a native of Tangier, who was one of the very first Moroccan to graduate Columbia University in the 20s as a student of Franz Boas, the American anthropologist who developed the concept of cultural relativism. That's quite interesting. It engages in conversation what I said earlier, the notion that Eastern cultures or any culture are essential or fixed, and that's a very interesting development. So after Naon truly break the glass ceiling or the ghetto walls, metaphorically, of course, of for surrounding in Morocco, and went to Colombia, she returned to Tangier in 1929 to collect Spanish ballad song in what she defined in her book, in the introduction to her book in 1929, as a language no longer heard. Naon was one of the first mobilizers of this network of ethnographers in Tangier in the 20s against the background of colonialism, of this tremendous change in their form of life. And she opened the path for an entire what I can define now as a salvage ethnography expressing nostalgia for Haketia traditions and related form of Jewish folklore. And by the way, that was not just, a local thing. We can just use Jeffrey Weidenger's ethnographic impulse. He talks about how, there are some preservations of musical traditions in the Pale of the settlements, for instance, in Kiev, during more or less the same time. And I can address another topic here. Before now, Jose Benoliel, for instance, worked on another aspect. He was a professor of Romance philology in Lisbon in 1880s, I think, and he was one of the very first individuals to mobilize the northern Morocco, the new Jewish community in Portugal in the late 19th century, while serving as a leader in Tangier just like 20 years later, from the 1920s. He became one of the very first academics in the world to publish scientific articles on Haketia, many of which appeared in the bulletin of the Spanish Royal Academy. So that brings another, let's say, layer of complexity to what I'm saying here, or another aspect of Sephardi heritage formation in the Spanish colonial context, because, quite ironically, even in the view of Spanish colonialists, nostalgic appeal to pre-1492 Iberia, rather than just a linear process of re-Hispanization, made sense as far as the narrative concerned. And the narrative describes Sephardic Jews as compatriots and as people who actually waited for Spain to come and, re-encounter with them, or Spaniards. Now, just a very brief remark to, summarize what I'm saying here. You might think that this is just like an intellectual discussion that characterizes a very small elite. But I think, according to my work, that unlike the Ottoman East, in northern Morocco, the Philo-Sephardi discourse, or whatever we want to call it, it was also incarnated in day-to-day encounters between Spaniards and Jews. And it had a political implication and meaning and social implication. Jews learned to shape their heritage vis-a-vis day-to-day practice, encounter with Spaniards. And it also had some, even the academic, the intellectual speech about it, it's brought about ethnographic methods that actually went to search for those living roots of Jews in pre-expulsion Iberia, rather than just, through searching them for, in text, or to what was really characterizing the German Jewish scholarship at the time. And people went to speak to their relatives. I mentioned Nahon, so a relative too, Suzanne Simenon de Toledano, and also other colleagues from Columbia University, Federico de Onis and Luna Benaim Boaknin, and other figures were working there to actually recollect, or basically collect and help people recollect, or talk about their past. And also by reading the press, by the way, the Jewish press, you can see so many references to the past in a very, very popular, basically the media, the Jewish media, and also even the Hispanophone non-Jewish media, like España, for instance. Of course, also in Renacimiento de Israel, in Adelante, and all those, very popular newspapers read by Jews in the North. So, yeah, that's my take on it.
I think there's, with regards to this Philo-Sephardi narrative, I agree that it was part and parcel of the explicit policies of the protectorate, but I find that, it's hard to ignore the fact that the majority of the protectorate happened under Franco's regime. And a lot of the experiences of ambivalence that we find all the time among Spanish Moroccan Jews, about how, the one hand, there is this identification with Spain, if we take it as face value, but on the other hand, there's a lot of ambivalence as well, especially among those that lived there for a long time, meaning those who grew up there and who were well aware of the the anti-Semitism of of Franco's regime, even though Franco then knew how to make it appear as if he had been behind the initiatives to save Jews and all this. But also there is a certain ambivalence also among within the Sephardi discourse as well. There is an embedded anti-Semitism in the Sephardi discourse as well. So I think what's interesting also among all the things that you've said, but what's also interesting in the Spanish Moroccan case is this ambivalence, this identification on the one hand, and the power of the shared language and the shared historical origin, and the negative connotations of that shared origin is and the fantasies about Jews that Spaniards had and continue to have today, but Spaniards had during that time, and how all this is like a dance that was happening every day, all the time, and created a very particular Sephardic identity.
I agree with you. But what you define as ambiguity, I would also define in specific contexts and periods as boundary work, right? You need to constantly shape your identity vis-a-vis others. And this ambiguity sometimes translates to specific networks that go in different ways to redefine Sephardi identities. And at the same time, you have Jews like participating in Las Compasas. They celebrate, 100%. All those things that really, make them really attached to Spanish culture. And then when they go home, they can completely relate to, their Spanish identities from a different perspective.
100%. And the fact is that there was so limited assimilation. So 100%. Totally.
Yeah. And also Franco's years are really, that's a turn of event. It's completely different because he was a fascist. And, the Second World War wasn't easy. It wasn't a very, very difficult time to live in the region. And also we need to differentiate between Tangier and the Protectorate.
Totally. Yeah.
So, but that's a different, I'm not sure we want to,
It's a different, I don't think we should go into that. Yeah. So I will go to my next question, if it's okay with you.
Yeah.
So it actually relates to this. So by the time that colonialism had officially ended, already by the 1960s, Morocco had lost most of its Jewish population, who became immigrants elsewhere. In the case of northern Morocco, besides Israel, some of the preferred destinations were Venezuela, Argentina, but also Spain, Canada, among other places. You have studied many of these migrations and the way in which colonialism continued to play a role in the identity formation of Moroccan Jews in the different places where they settled. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about how, in your opinion, your research introduces a different perspective on Jewish migration from Arab countries.
Yeah, well, wonderful question. I like it a lot. It takes me back to my response to your first question. I think that tradition and modernity are dialectical. I think to understand this approach and why it's significant for reconceptualizing migration, we need to mention some of the prominent notions about Jewish migration in general, Sephardi migration or Mizrahi Sephardi migration in particular as exceptional or, as upshots of fixed ethnic identities. Think about it. One of the most prominent narratives about Jewish migration is grounded in this Eurocentric Zionist concept that the state of Israel rescued Jews from hostile Islamic surroundings, by bringing them to Israel, to modern Israel. And another related nationalistic colonial view is that the more modern strata of Middle East and North African Jewry, those who had graduated the colonial school, you mentioned the European, the Alliance Universelle, the European schools, those who commanded European languages, they were sometimes indifferent to Zionism, to Israel. They chose the ultimate path to the West, to Westernization, by immigrating there. They left to France, Canada, Spain, the Americas, and so on and so forth. Now, these widespread colonial national accounts, in my view, were grounded in this Eurocentric, perception about migration outside of the East as a passage toward emancipation, liberation, modernity, the way, it is traditionally defined. And it basically implied, this is something that I want to emphasize, that continuous expression of affinity toward those pre-immigration Islamic or Arab lands were just temporary gaps stemming from this lagging modernization process, and we know about many social scientists like even Eisenstadt, in his early work from the 50s, who explained until the 70s that Jews will modernize eventually. It just takes time, right? Those people who are coming from the East will eventually transform. Now, in the 80s, and I hope that gives the broader context of what I want to say. In the 80s, a different critical approach began to prominently challenge the notion that migration reflected a process of cultural, political disengagement from Morocco, from the East, and the place of origin. And in our specific field, according to this new account, European colonialism and Zionism basically destroyed the Jewish-Muslim safe and sound relation, leading to this mass immigration of Jews from Islamic countries, from the Islamic East in the aftermath of colonialism, basically. And again, reattachment after a generation or two to the Moroccan tradition, to the Moroccan homeland, was just like a correction of historic injustice, that was particularly, taking place in Israel, in the Israeli national context. Now, here again, I think that drawing on the case of Spanish Morocco, I can argue for a more dialectical form of interaction between identities and immigration and, identity of immigrants and the way basically migration processes are engaged with identity formation. And just to very quickly refer to, my work on this, in the 19th century, Gibraltar, even before that, by the way, the Canary Islands, the Caribbean seaboard, Brazilian Amazon, all those, exotic places and many other locations in the United States, in Canada, not in Canada by that time, but later, all those places basically, attracted hundreds of Jews from Morocco. Many of them were the so-called modernized alumni of the Alliance Israelite Universelle, the modernized Jews I mentioned earlier. And Moroccan Jews in those places were scattered across, various places, and they were not necessarily working according to their own, ethnic backgrounds. But at the same time, they were the ones who established one of the earliest diaspora institutions and organizations created by Moroccans abroad altogether, not just by Jews, right? So it was very early. We can think about those organizations created in Buenos Aires in the late 19th century, the Congregación Israelita Latina, for instance. Even earlier than that, we can think about the newspapers issued in Gibraltar, Tikvat Israel, even in the 40s, in Iran, in many other places. And they basically, when you think about it, those frameworks really provided what needed for immigrants to invigorate their Moroccan ethnicity and engage in cultural and social ties with their hometowns, even though they were just distancing from Morocco, right? That's one way to approach it. But another way I'd like to stress, and this is something that is very, very prominent in my research, that we need to say that very few studies examining how these dynamics I mentioned came to influence local perception of global migration in Morocco, and how they came to develop new migration-related practices or actually communal traditions in Morocco itself. More than anything, when you look at the records, the association of migration to Latin America, to all those new places with wealth, was fueled by the flow of remittances, even, most of the time through religious institutions. Think about Achnasat Orchim, for instance, in Morocco. They got money from abroad all the time. There were legendary stories about those who made it in the Americas, and even they were sometimes narrated in retrospect, after 20 or 30 years. When you read the newspapers like Renacimiento in the 20s, you see they write about the generosity of communities in Latin America, those who never forget not just their kings, but also the entire community. You see new businesses, you see blessing for, Peru's Independence Day. You see how those returnees build their, new businesses like Grand Bazaar, like Kenya, for instance, in Tetuan. All those, traveling in so many, manifestations of this. Now, exploring these transnational dynamics, that I focus on in my work and help us bring this study of migration, which is usually deemed exceptional, ethnicity-based. It helps the conversation get closer to the broader study of migration from Morocco to Muslim migration, even if it happens a little later, but or even during the same time. And yet, it helps us appreciate how global migration was imbued in the community's self-pride and networks, even generated a sense of superiority over those non-mobile communities in the region. And if I have time, I want to just very briefly remark that, preserving the legendary characteristic of migration to Latin America was also the interest of Spanish colonialism. The transnational link between Morocco and Latin America through Jewish graduate of the French school, ironically, they came to learn about French culture and they emigrated to Latin America and, really improved their Spanish by so doing. For the Spanish colonial regime, it was a way to maintain those cultural connections and connect older and newer Spain, the Spanish colonies in northern Morocco and in Latin America. You see all those references in the early 20s by Ortega, Pulido, to how those loyal Spanish agents are, becoming Spaniards by their migration. And it also goes well into the 1950s. There were publications even by, you mentioned Franco, even, is the General Franco's Institute for Hispano-Arab Studies published one of probably the most, debated or discussed work in this context, Indiano Tetuanis, about those, who came back. It was authored by a Venezuelan author, we should say that, a returning immigrant to Tetuan. And he wrote about, this journey as a way to alleviate, economic burdens in Morocco. And it was also published, by the way, in Venezuelan newspapers. When you read Mundo Israelita by, in the 40s, before it was published, this, novel in Morocco, they also write about it. So it's like a transnational dynamics of identity preserving, of, writing about migration as a unique phenomena in the community. Now, and just to sum up, my point is that this circular and ongoing transnational, transregional migration continue to create multiple layers of Sephardi memory among Sephardi Moroccan communities under colonialism, but also on the move, as you mentioned. Regardless of, this borderline that we are used to hear about, that distinguishes between pre-1948 and post-1948. You can look at those, development in Venezuela, for instance, just to mention very briefly, in Magen Escudo, for instance, you see our first generation of immigrants in the 70s entwine their memory from Morocco with memory from pre-1492 Spain, because it helped them, portray themselves as Spaniards, even exotic Spaniards in a way. That was part of the, the ideology of the mestizaje in Latin America that basically served Moroccans more than it served Ashkenazim. It also led, very ironically, to the playing down of their newer experiences back in Morocco under Spanish colonialism in the 20th century, because they barely focused on them. They focused more on, this aspects of ethnicity formation as Sephardi Jews that happened in Morocco, on Haketia preservation, on the earlier journey in the 19th century to Venezuela. And it's quite extraordinary to see all those layers of memory, how they, give meaning to the movement over time. And they're not necessarily working according to the boundaries we're used to, hear about or, frame our understanding of migration in the field. So I hope that, that answers your question.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment about our shared work, about how these how memories are shaped in the context of migration, and how we, Aviad and I have been working together for many years. And one of our publications was actually about the trip back to Morocco and how Moroccan Jews from Israel and Argentina retold this trip back to Morocco based on their immigration experiences. And this takes me to the point that I wanted to just add to what you were saying about how the value of being of European origin, even if this European origin is Spanish, because Spain's position within Europe has never been that clear. Spain was basically, you know, how the French would say that Africa starts in the Pyrenees. Spain, in the context of the rest of Europe, of European countries, continues to be seen through the Moorish lens, and it continues to be this exotic place where people don't really like to work, and where people are not really European. So it's interesting also how Spain becomes Europe in the memories of migrants that need a European origin in order to be able to integrate in the new societies. And this is something that you and I have worked on in both together and separately. And I was thinking about how something that really struck me in my field work in Argentina was about how the role of Spain was almost like when I would ask about Spain, they would always say something very general about, 1492, the Sephardi coming from Spain, something very general and historical, but nothing. It didn't seem to play a role in their identity formation, and they were very critical, actually, because they do remember having behaved as if they were Spanish when they lived in Tetuan and all this place, and they were like, what were we doing? And they became very critical with it because this European origin didn't serve them in Argentina. They didn't need it because the identity that was threatened was the Jewish identity, and therefore they had to be more Moroccan than ever in order to preserve that. I mean,
they never, become Europeans all the way through in many contexts. Even in Venezuela, they say this ideology of the mestizaje gives them a privilege in a way to reclaim their roots, both in Morocco and in Spain. It's a different, it's not even in Israel. They talk about Haketia as their own identity. What is Haketia? We'll get to it. I mean, it's so you're right. I mean, they're Spanish, but at the same time, they're also making sure that people would know that they're not Spanish all the way through. And also, you're right. I mean, Spain was seen as, as the back, stage of Europe, so the backyard of Europe, right? In many years, and sometimes
even the other neighborhood. Not even Aviad, I'm being told that we have 5 minutes, so I'm going to move to my next question. Okay.
Okay. Wow. Okay.
So one of the motivations behind this series was the dissatisfaction with the most extended scholarly frameworks in Jewish studies, which are almost exclusively based on the Ashkenazi experience of modernity and assume all the principles of European modernity. There's exceptional scholarship outside of those frameworks, but the mainstream continues to be based on the European reordering of the world into dichotomies that coincide with the spheres that were separated throughout European modernity, meaning religious versus secular, East versus West, among them. As a consequence, Moroccan traditions and ways of understanding the relation between Judaism and modernity tend to be approached from a perspective that is embedded in the Ashkenazi experience, and that which is the framework of reference to which Moroccan traditions tend to be compared. Most Moroccan Jews reside today in Israel and other places with large hubs of European Jewry. And you have referred to these dynamics as connected to migration as well. How do you think that the Spanish-Moroccan Jewish case may contribute to the study of these interactions between different frameworks from which to understand Sephardi and Ashkenazi experiences?
I think it practically encourages us to move beyond the nationalistic, as you've described, understanding of Moroccan identities as homogeneous or hegemonic, or something that is shaped vis-a-vis the Ashkenazi hegemony, as you mentioned, or alternatively vis-a-vis the Moroccan national society. Like Morocco was a unified national unit, And you know, when you look at the community in Israel, as you mentioned, distinguishing themselves from the broader Moroccan community, which came from the south. First of all, it wasn't an Israeli phenomenon. We should say that. You know, the word for hostels, for instance, it was in use in Morocco for many years. But immigration to Israel, as you mentioned, after 1948, intensified the encounter between the groups, like I think like anywhere else or like never before, and it imbued it with national meaning. So the fact that the Israeli establishments stereotype Moroccans are of culturally background, also, you know, intensified this construction of a separate narrative about Spain, as you mentioned, both modern and pre-1492 Spain among the Jews of the North, but it also gave new meaning to their community formation. I can give you one example from an event which is quite relevant to this time of the year, you know, the Mimuna, the Jewish celebration of, you know, marking the return of eating chametz after Passover, which became very associated with Moroccan customs and traditions in Israel. Now, against the backdrop of this tradition, there was a particularized ethnic revival taking place among Moroccans in Israel, if you judge by the very first community organization, Mabat, for instance, Mifgash Bnei Tanjil, the initials for the reunion of Tanjil's natives. And you read the records and you see that the founders explicitly state that Mabat is dissatisfied, or there is a discontent with this custom of celebrating Mas Mimunas in national parks. It doesn't represent our traditions in Morocco. And then there comes this expression in Mabat, records. In one of the circulars sent to the, to all the members, titled "We Need Everybody," that we certainly have the obligation to increase the awareness of the Israeli public to the fact that not all Jews of Morocco are of Arab Berber origins or cultures, right? And that's a very interesting remark, because at first sight, when you mentioned the acting white aspect, right? The ishtaknizut, as we say in Hebrew, becoming Ashkenazi. At first sight, you think that this is what they're doing, denying the aspects of their authentic Arabic or Judeo-Arabic, Maghrebi past, in just an attempt to be accepted by the Ashkenazi Zionist establishment in Israel. But at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, in Israel, Mabat also declared the preservation of Haketia as one of its goals, which really dwelled on the combination of Arabic and Spanish components. And Haketia, remind you, it was vanishing in Morocco. So nostalgia for Haketia was basically, something that gave meaning to boundary work in Israel itself. And I want to very briefly remark, if we have time. I don't know if you want to move to the next question, or you want me to reflect on. Do we have time to hear more questions? Or
I think we have
another 5 minutes. Yeah, 5. 7.
Yeah, we can take another 5 minutes for the next question. So if you want to add something shortly and then move to the next question.
No. So maybe we can wait for the next question, because I don't want to. If I have more time without the question, then I will continue reflecting. But I want to leave time for the
so
next
maybe
question.
keep that thought for the Q&A. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
We have both worked on Moroccan migrations to places different than Israel, especially the Americas and Spain, where their experience could not have been more different. In your publications, you have referred to this idea of invention, quote unquote, of traditions and its connection to migration. Maybe you can expand a bit more on this idea, and more specifically, how this dynamic was different in Israel than in other places. And I think you will have maybe an opportunity to refer to, to add the comment that probably you wanted to make.
Actually, yeah, it works perfect, because what I want to say, I hope it will answer your question. Appropriately, most studies that address this dynamic of diaspora making and the related multiplicity of homelands among Sephardi Mizrahi Jews altogether look at Israel as a very exceptional and isolated case, isolated from the rest, from Argentina, from Europe, from America, and so on and so forth. And I think that, just to answer your question, I'd like to stress my argument that migration of Jews to Israel, not necessarily of Moroccan Jews from the north, but certainly in that case too, emerge within a wider frame of reference. This dynamic communal web that had been evolving since the 19th century and is still evolving in many ways, right? And I think it helps us stress both the local, national context, which is certainly very important, but also the global network that transcended those national borders and was basically influenced by a completely different kind of, diaspora power relations, not just between Ashkenazim and Moroccans in Israel, but also between the different hubs and parts of the diaspora, right? That's probably one of the ways to address your question. Israel was different from the rest because it had a very specific position on that global network. While Mabat, I mentioned this, Mabat was indeed an Israeli organization. Emerging with this local context, it was also, and that's an interesting development, it was also a center of diffusion for those traditional narratives about Hispanic and pre-1492 traditions to those smaller centers in the West, in France, where you have a larger North African community, but a very small community of Jews from the North, relatively, to Canada, to the United States. They actually established sister organizations, the Mabat France, for instance, France Mabat, sorry, that's the other way around. Well, it was established by people from Mabat. It was established after a trip to Israel of that specific French network. Mabat USA, Afikoman in certain contexts or in a different phrase, was also established at the Yeshiva University. You had organizations in Canada emulating what was happening in Israel. So basically what I want to say that, this development has broader implication for the way we study Sephardi ethnicity in Israel locally, because it brings it into a broader conversation about transnationalism and about the global context of communities in Israel. So rather than just comparing, and we can certainly compare, we also need to view Israel as just one of these many prominent nodes on the dynamic map of the globalizing Hispanic Moroccan diaspora. And then I think we can add another layer of complexity to your discussion of Sephardi multiplicity, on Sephardi modernity as a traveling concept, as something that is, also being, articulated and phrased through interconnectivity between different hubs. Okay, now having said that, I can certainly talk about different, regional contexts, like, in Spain, the Moroccan community was a very, very prominent community. It was one of the first to, engage in high politics. And they did not have those, very difficult dynamics with Ashkenazi communities as in Israel. In Latin America, you had this mestizaje traditions I mentioned. It was very Hispanophone, region, but also, you can also take those non-Hispanophone countries where even the United States, where sometimes those, people who speak Spanish are just referred to as, Latinos, which is quite interesting. You see people from Venezuela with a Moroccan background, sometimes even, in a very, using the very specific way of speaking Spanish in Morocco. They're coming to, all those places with Latino immigrants. Yeah. And so maybe just a very, very brief remark to conclude this. We may also draw, I think, a conclusion on the advantages of being such a small, distinct group, rather than on, the disadvantages of, this specific existence. With the help of interconnected individuals, political and demographic disadvantages of Spanish Moroccan Jews in Morocco, and more so in hubs like France or in Latin America or in Canada, for instance, they became, means for broader interactions or border crossing comradeship and related narratives about the shared past that were just passing through those networks. And that's my perspective on this. I hope it makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. Yeah, I think we can. I don't know if I should maybe reply and then open for Q&A. Yeah. Okay. So this was all so interesting, and I'm just so happy we're having this conversation in this forum. And and I think there would be so much more to say and to continue to talk about, because all these are like huge topics that we've opened. I guess I think that we would be remiss if we didn't make a reference about the question of what happened in Israel. And which I know that for you is the question, and for me is the question as well. And it's one of the motors behind our search into this story. To me, the big question would be how is it possible? And I know we all know the answer, but the question still stands. How is it possible that a community that was such a transnational community, such an educated community, so exposed to the world, became or ended up being reduced and categorized and as backwards, and went through a tremendous downshifting, and how these memories of this past in Morocco play a completely different role when you have this experience of humiliation, how these memories acquire a completely different meaning, and they become part of your proof of who you are. Whereas in other contexts where Moroccans arrived, these memories became a little bit more of a folklore in the good sense, meaning they wanted to preserve this because they didn't want this to be lost, and they wanted to be able to pass this on to their children, but they didn't need to prove anything to anyone. They just needed to make sure that there would be continuity. So this needed to become a story and a practice that could be passed on, and then it had to be simplified for that purpose. But in Israel, there is first an intergenerational, not in all cases, but we do see an intergenerational break, and a use of this past that stems from a very painful experience. This past then becomes a proof that you're not what everybody insists that you are. And I think we would be remiss if we didn't make a comment about this context.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyways, so I don't know if you want to reply to that, or we can just gather questions. Are there questions in the chat already? There's only one.
Just one short question for now, but maybe if we invite people to start get some.
Yeah. So if people want to ask a question and they want to ask it personally, please. Oh, Moise is just raised his hand, but you said that there was one more question before, Moise.
There's one short clarification from Dvoraya now. She's asking, what was the name of the student of Boaz, I think, Franz, you mentioned before?
I think there's yeah, you have bad connection. I think what is the student of Fran Boaz, you said? The name of the student of Boaz.
Yeah, Sarita Nahon.
Sarita Nahon.
Sarita Nahon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So Moise has a comment or a question. Moise, do you want to open your mic? You have a problem with the mic. Maybe if you want to, see if you can fix it. If not, maybe you can just type it and Roy will read it for you.
Yeah.
In the meantime, if
push
somebody
the
wants,
space bar, push the space bar works too. I don't know if it will work for you.
I don't know what just happened. Anyways, if someone else wants to ask a question.
We have one question from Suagis Sandoval. Do you want to ask the question yourself, or should I read out your?
Yes, hi, Suhei Sandoval, so Suhei or Suha, here in Los Angeles, California. I have two questions. Is there sort of a book that has a good comprehensive history regarding the Sephardi jewelry, if there is one? And then what is a good resource here in Los Angeles, if any, for those of us that want to learn Ladino?
Well, do you want to respond to that, Angie, or?
Oh, I have no idea. I don't know where. Yeah.
The Ladino scene is really, I mean, you can look at the works by Devin Naar, for instance. If you're looking at specific works on the Moroccan community in Los Angeles, you can read some of Omar Boom recent works.
That's right.
Some really interesting work on that. There are a bunch of writing, by I think Rabbi Abuskila, forgot his name. People are writing on this also from the community perspective. It's not just academic writing. And can also try to speak to maybe Michal Bitton, who is conducting a project on this.
That's right. Yeah.
You might, be interested in this.
Yeah, and we are in this project, so I should have remembered that.
Yeah.
I included my email in an earlier chat text that I sent and my cell phone number. I'd be interested in doing that. So thank you. And thank you all for having me and for being here. And
sure.
Like I said, it's 9 a.m. here, and I've been going since 6 a.m. on a few meetings. So apologies for my camera going on and off. I've been having breakfast and our four-legged family member.
It's all good. It's all good. So there's another question, right, Roy?
Yes, I just want to invite Moise to, if he fixed his mic, if you'd like to ask his question. And if it's not going to happen, then Moise, you can try and write the question in the chat, and I'll ask it. Jaime has a question that I will read. Can you discuss the issue of the erasure and eradication of the Berber, Arabo-Judeo origins and identities of Moroccan Jews under Ashkenazation pressures following their mass exodus to Israel, which is, I think, refers to what you were talking about just before we started the Q&A session.
Yeah, so there was this understanding that, when you come to Israel, you're supposed to get rid of your exilic identities, right? That's the Zionist mainstream narrative, and that's the melting pot legacy of Israel. But in the case of Arab, even Berber, because people did not necessarily distinguish between those, nuances. In the case of the Arab culture, you need to get rid of this also because they were, first of all, backwards, quote unquote, but also the, cultures of your enemy. So you could not, basically not make any sense in the national context, Israeli national context, that you will be both Zionist and also, someone who identified with another culture, or, even if it's not national, another culture from, from the Arab world, right? And that's the context of what I was saying. Now, if you did not, basically, if you try to, revive your identity, you're basically correcting this injustice. In the context of the Moroccan Jews from the north, they did not comply all the way through with this because that was not the tradition all the way, right? It was a different kind of tradition that really was imbued with all those Spanish identities and reference to Spain. So when you put an emphasis on the Spanish identity, and they did in many ways or in many contexts, you might assume that they did not basically, comply with this restoring of Arab Judeo traditions in Israel. They were just basically shying away from this. They were basically trying to become part of the mainstream narrative that tried to redefine their culture through Europe, through European values, like the State of Israel had wanted to, describe and see itself since its even before its formation in 1948. And my observation on this is this is not the right way to look at it, because they were basically looking at it also from a local perspective, but also from a globalized perspective that has roots in their prior, pre-immigration histories, and also in their more globalized, developments, or more, globalized settings of the existence as a community. And that was my point. If I hope it made sense, and if I clarified what I want to say. And you wanna?
I think yeah. No, yeah.
Hi.
Yep.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we do. We hear you loud and clear.
Yeah, well, there's not enough light. No?
Okay.
Okay, hi. To those who don't
Hi,
know me,
Moise.
now there's the light beside. Behind. Yeah. Okay, no, it's not good either.
It's okay. We hear
Okay,
you.
it's okay, it's okay. It should not move. Okay, to those who do not know me, I am Moise Belaroche. I wrote the Tetuan trilogy. And when I heard all this lecture, I asked myself, where were you in 1980 when I had to do all this research myself to write the Keys de Tetuan trilogy? And the first part is the Keys to Tetuan. And indeed, the Keys to Tetuan, one of them you spoke about is the migration and the immigration. And the other one is the la Alianza, as they call it, the Alliance Israélite Universelle. But now that I've heard you, I think we all of us, were putting too much stress, giving too much weight to the migration, and forget something else, is the localism of the Tetuani Jew. He not only immigrates, but he comes back. And I know personally, a person of my generation, that for 4 generations, they went to Oran, they came back to get married to Tetuan. The great-grandfather, the grandfather, the father, they came back. They kept coming back all the time to continue a certain community that is parallel to Tetuan. Yes, this happened also in Tangier, in Alcázar. This happens everywhere in the area. And that is very Arab. The idea of being from a certain place, not a country. And when you are to Israel, you become part of an immigration that is from Morocco. What is from Morocco? No Moroccan is from Morocco. No Moroccan that immigrated from Morocco is either from Marrakesh, he's from Fez, he's from the Palestinians. I understand when you speak to a Palestinian, you say, I'm from Bethlehem, I am from Nablus, I am from Jerusalem. They are not from a country. And that, I think we've gone too far with this concept that the Moroccan Jew is and they stayed there. They stayed there even more than the others. Yes, they left and they came back. And in the time of the 19th century, they came back to live. They immigrated to Brazil, and then they came back to live. My 2 great-grandfathers, they have a paper of nationality of Reino de Pará, do Pará, the Brazilian nationality. I can have the Brazilian nationality too. And they came back to live. And indeed, and not only that, they built the modern Tetuan. The second point is that there is a second point that is not so stressed as the Jews from this. The fact that the Jews from Tetuan are Sephardi doesn't differentiate them from they were expelled from Spain, doesn't differentiate them from the local Muslim community. The Muslim community is also expelled Sephardi, and they're very proud of it.
Yes.
And so they are always, there's always a contact with Europe, and also through the language, the Spanish language, the Haketia. And from 1860, there is a connection again. And interestingly, it's in the 1860s, is a renewed connection with Spain, and also an opening to France, 1862. Immediately, in the same 2 years, the Jews come back to Europe and are connected now to Central Europe. So they're not, and also geographically, I mean, Tetuan is the closest city to Europe, the closest Jewish city to Europe in the Arab world, yes. So that is not so impressive that they start having contact with the European. They were always in contact with the European. That didn't change. And so the language, the colonialism of Spain in Morocco, in northern Morocco, doesn't bring a new language. It adapts the Haketia, the language that the Jews brought from Spain to Morocco. It adapts to the new Spanish language. So people would argue that the Haketia, that there is some sort of colonialism. The Haketia is a specific language that is not Spanish. It's not Spanish, but I think that it's just that they retook the connection with Europe. Now, what Europe? Because
Moise, I just ask you maybe to make a last point so that
we're from Muslim Europe.
Moise,
we come from Islamic Europe.
I don't know if you can hear me.
The moment that the Christians take over of Europe, it's the end of the Jewry in Europe, in Spain. So we are there in the middle of this Muslim and Spanish cultures, and we are part of everything. As is Morocco. Morocco is also part of Europe. Economically, it was always part of Spain.
Moise, I wonder if we can give a chance.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Moise.
Thank you, Moise.
This is very, very, Again,
absolutely.
there would be, Go ahead, Aviad.
So I try to be very brief because I want to leave time also for you, Angie, to reflect on this. But I thank you so much for this question, because that was my exact point here about circular migration, about the closer dynamics between Muslim migration and Jewish migration that I mentioned. How they're coming back and they're seeing their place of origin as something that they need to send remittances to. They need to take care of, even if they're living as Western immigrants, so to speak. Who go to Argentina or other places. That's something that you find among other Moroccan immigrants, even in the interwar period, and even among, much later, of course, in the post-colonial period. But by the way, I must mention, it's not an Arab thing. You can think about the Landmannschaften and all those, European organizations that really refer back to their places of origin. You can look at let's say, Rebecca Cobrin's book writes exactly about this from a Eastern European perspective. That's something that really belongs to the free national world, to the imperial world, to a very different construction or structure of the world that we cannot imagine today as people living in a very national context. Now, the case of Spanish Morocco helps us diversify the Moroccan case. Okay, it helps us think about all those sub-regional contexts, about all those places. Why Jews leave, for instance, from Tetuan to Venezuela, of all places? That's a question that many migration scholars should and probably do ask about other regional context of migration of Muslims, of Amazigh people. Why people from specific places in the Sus left to specific neighborhoods in Paris. That's something that can definitely, it should be asked, and it can definitely, my conversation today can definitely contribute to this. Now you talked also about the shared interest in Spain. Of course, that's something that it's very, I think that's the point of departure of why so many Moroccan Muslims today are interested in this history, because it brings them this globalized or more, let's say, interesting perspective about the outset of the migration from Morocco. They consider it a Moroccan migration, even though they're also looking at the regional context, as I said earlier, but also they're looking at the past in Al-Andalus, which is also very interesting for their own way of reflecting on their own national histories in a way, right? So all those things that characterize the Jews in northern Morocco can really give a twist to their own history. Now, you also mentioned something very interesting about their ties with Europe. We need to realize and remember that those dichotomies that divide between Ashkenazim in Europe and Sephardim in the East did not necessarily work in this case. Those people of the Junta, for instance, in the 19th century, they work in Montefiore, with the Sephardi community in Manchester, in London. Those people are coming from Morocco. They're sent by the Sultan to work there, right? So they're Moroccans in a way. They're working with Gibraltar. So these divisions that we are used to think about when we think about Europe and Morocco, they're developing over time. But even today, think about it, North Africans in Europe constitute the largest Jewish community. I'm talking about France, of course, right? So we also need to, work or rework our understanding that, migration is something that is necessarily a passage from east to west, because it's all about, how those categories that we used to think about, work with to explain migration from Morocco are really being framed in of itself from the beginning, okay, prior to the actual existence. That's my point.
And just to add very briefly to that, I think all the things that we said were very interesting, and it would, if we really opened them, we would not leave here. And then also the narrative of Al-Andalus, again, like Spain's place in Europe, and the narrative of Al-Andalus, like as Eric Calderwood has shown, it was later used also by Morocco itself to develop a national identity project and a national discourse based on Al-Andalus, the same discourse that was used by Spanish colonialists and also used by Franco, who was known to many as the African. So it's the Tetuan as being this little piece of Al-Andalus, like this little Granada. I've even heard this from Moroccan representatives as being like a window or like the last bastion of this, with all these populations that were originally Spanish, including the Muslim population. The way in which this is reclaimed in the context of Spanish colonialism, I think it's very unusual in the context of European colonization. This claim of the shared roots, it's very sui generis, and I think this is one of the things that fascinates us all. The return, I just wanted to add a very brief comment on this thing, very important thing that Moise said about how generationally people would go back we'll go back to the one to get married and all this, and even to circumcise their children, and even so there would be this constant flow of people and this connection to the city that continued to be home while other homes were being built, but you would go back there. And I agree that the idea that you are from a city or from a town, it's also, you can find that in Spain very clearly, like people are from a specific place, but in the context of a nation state, and that forces you to change the paradigm. And probably, yeah, you're right, Moise, that I think that specifically Aviad and I do go out of our way to speak about the local origin of everybody we talk to, and to explain the differences between the different towns and the different connections that people have with these towns. But it's true that many times I at least end up generalizing because that is the framework that you're talking to. So yeah. Anyways, yeah, it's there's like so much one could add, but we only have a few more minutes. Roy, how's the?
Yes. Yeah, so I'll give you a few questions so you can respond to them all. One is actually just that Jaime in the chat wants Moise Benelroche's email to talk to him. So
can you put your email on the chat?
Yes. And then I'll ask these questions here. Nguyen wants to know, they're wondering whether psychological aspects took a key role, or what type of integrating role psychological aspects took in the process of identity formation. John Levison is asking, I'm curious about the intersections of class and gender on, for example, transnational Moroccan identity versus Israeli Mizrahi identity, versus perhaps others like European or Latin American identities. And Michal Friedman is asking, could you tell us a bit about some of the dynamics you discussed in other contexts regarding the earliest waves of migration of Moroccan Sephardis to Spain?
Okay, what should we take first?
I think you should take the last one, maybe.
About migration to Spain, yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I must admit, I did not work on this as much as I worked on this as in the Latin American context, but I can tell you that from what I know, most of the Jews who went to Spain, they went there, invisibly, right? In many ways, right? They just like passed with when the borders were, opened in the 19th century, and some were, entering with Spanish passports because they were, were seen as beneficial to the Spanish colonial system. But the community really developed very late in Spain. You need to get for instance, the kosher meat from Gibraltar until very late in the 60s and 70s. They need to, work to create the community, because Spain was a very difficult, under Franco, obviously, a very difficult place to develop a Jewish community. It was very anti-Semitic in many ways. Today, this is the Israeli Holocaust Day, so we must mention, Franco's role in the war and how people tried to get into Spain. And even though the narrative later was that Franco, admitted entry, it wasn't true, right? But people still, immigrated undercover, so to speak, right? They came and they engaged in commerce, and only in the 60s and 70s you see new community institutions. You see how Jews become more engaged in local politics and rebranding Spain, even during Franco's desarrollo, the years of development in Morocco, in Spain, sorry, which were very important to think about new global alignments and economic opportunities. But the Jewish community in Spain eventually became very prominent on the hub. And it's very interesting because think about it, they're always speaking about Spain nostalgically as a hub, as an epicenter for the identity formation. The distance in many ways from Spain, and then they're coming to Spain. I don't want to use the word repatriating, because it's not the appropriate term, but they're coming back to Spain, and then you see like a blast, a boom of publications and writing about past in Spain. So this is a very interesting dynamics. Usually nostalgia works by distancing for a place. And now you see a population coming to a specific place and writing about their past in this place by immigrating to it. So that's a very interesting, I think, characteristic of immigration from northern Morocco to Spain. That's my, very intuitive response to this very interesting question. What else?
I would just add to this that there's a question about the intersection between gender and class, and I just wanted to add very briefly that this is indeed a very important question when it comes to studying, for example, the preservation of Jaquetia and the prominence of Jaquetia as an everyday language, the question of social class, and also the question of Westernization. The acquisition, the adoption of Spanish habits, so to say, is much more prominent among the middle and upper classes than among the lower classes, and so in that sense, this is actually something that I started paying attention to when I started becoming interested in this adoption, quote unquote, of Spanish habits, and there is a gender difference in how many Spanish friends one would have. It's common to this is of course all a generalization, but women tend to say that the men would have more Spanish friends than them. One can find lots of cases of female friends, but in general, and that it was the men who would sit at the bar to eat the tapa, and that they joined the men. This is regardless of, again, of specific cases in which this may have not been the case. There is a gender difference in general. And the same thing with class. So in answer to your question, yes, there is a gender and class difference. I don't know, Aviad, if you would like to add something about that.
I must say that I didn't give it enough thought on this gender aspect, but now when I'm thinking about it, I'm grateful for this question. Most of the, proactive individuals who worked in, preserving Moroccan traditions were actually women. It's interesting. I mentioned Sarita now, and I mentioned all those, people who worked on the ethnography in Morocco itself, but also in the communities. Think about it. I'm talking about the Israeli context. Amada Avital, who established Mabat, and Gladys Pimienta, who I know and also Vanessa Paloma Elvaz, I'm not sure she's here, if she's not here. So. She worked about this, very specific aspect by looking at the musical traditions and the spatial context. Who was admitted into this very specific arena of identity formation and recounting, recollecting of memory. You couldn't get any man into this specific semi-private spaces in a way.
Yeah.
The patios.
Yeah, exactly.
The matesha, the custom of, so it's, I need to look deeper into this, delve deeper into this specific aspect. It's very interesting, but this is my very first observation about it. That you needed the women to, lead it in a way. And then when it became very formalized, like I mentioned Spain earlier, when you have like this, top politics institutions, and you had all those, global organizations, the Sephardi World Federation, all those organizations, now men became very dominant.
Yeah, when it comes to the preservation of memory, it's usually women, but when it comes to the institutionalization of that memory, then it shifts. Yeah.
And that also refers to the aspect of class. who is
Exactly.
capable of, mediating and distributing the narrative in a large scale, on a large scale, in a way.
Is there anything else?
Yes. So I'm going to ask just two last questions here, and then add a little question myself if we have time.
So we have 4 minutes. And I just want to say that my battery is very low. So I'm going to, please go ahead and ask the questions, and all that Aviad answer. I'm going to look for a charger. Okay. All in 1 minute.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll do our best here. I'm just going to re-ask one question from before, which is what role psychological aspects may have played in these processes of identity formation? Another by Nancy, do you have any comments about interfaith marriages in the communities that you're talking about? And one for myself is, we talked a lot about the way that about the boundary work, the way the communities standardize practices and then in a way excluded practices that were maybe more specific to local areas. In Montreal, this is very interesting because most of the Moroccans who moved to Montreal are not from the north of Morocco, from the Spanish area. But that becomes a standard example of the European origins of these Jews in Montreal. So in a way, the definition gets expanded to way more Moroccan Jews that were not included in those in Morocco. And I was wondering if you talk about the interplay of like the specification of these identities versus their expansion to larger communities.
Okay, let me see if I got your question right. I mean, basically, one of the way, and this is also refers to a concept that has been, raised here about the future. So I think it's really more healthy to look at the process as evolving, dynamic. There is like this concept of mobility and contact interactions in which you get this local context on the move all the time. It's not static. So it's mobility rather than just, space, and also onward migration rather than what we tend to hear in popular narratives about migration too, whether Canada, France, and other places as, immigration and integration. And then you have like conflict between all those groups sharing the space. No, we're talking about something else. It's onward migration, onward integration, onward, redefinitions of specific entities. And also, rather than just diaspora as a fixed identity or entity, it's also diaspora making. So I hope it, answers your question in a way. I don't want to get into more details, but that's my first, observation on this about interfaith marriage in the community. That's very interesting because you're not supposed to.
By José Luis Mateo Dieste.
Okay. So that's something that is, it's under research. Okay. We need to say that because of course, some works on this, but I believe that if you look at the, some kind of indications that you get from community records, you won't have enough references to intermarriage. That was a red line, obviously. Yeah. But at the same time, you see people like, with the converts, the people who are converting to Judaism. That means that they had held romantic relations before they married, right? So it gives you a sense of all those kind of interactions. Now, it's really interesting because, sometimes you hear those offhand remarks in interviews about, romantic relations between Spaniards and Jews specifically. Sometimes, they're being, that's a very interesting incident. You had a song specific about Christmas in one of the field trips that Shoshana Weiss-Shachak, when she accompanied the community, and then you hear a song about, Christmas, very joyful Christmas song, and then you hear a specific discussion about romantic relations between a girl from Tangier and a Spanish boyfriend, and it's being cut off very brutally by a remark that the rabbi entered the room. Now, what does that mean? It means that there are stories to be told, and that the habitus or the way, the formalization of, memory keeps them away, basically. So we need to work with those specific indications to find out what happened in all those, romantic scene, but put it that way. But obviously you don't have enough indications about intermarriage, because think about it. They probably went unnoticed or undocumented in community records, because that would basically make one cross the red line and exclude himself from the community in many ways. Now, by the way, having said that, in Latin America, you had this, very well-developed phenomena of, Moroccan, male living on their own, and there they intermarried. Not everybody came back to marry in Morocco with a nice Jewish girl, right? So that's a well-known story. It's easier to tell because it belongs to the distant past. It belongs to the 19th century in the community memory. So it's easier to refer to it. That's another indication.
We are past 2 minutes from the end of our seminar. And this is so if somebody reads Spanish here, Luis Mateo Dieste has a fantastic book about intermarriages in the context of the Spanish protectorate. And there are very few cases that deal with Jews, very few, because as Aviad said, it was very rare. Not that it was common among the other groups, honestly, but you should look it up. It's a fascinating book. And Aviad, I am sorry to have to cut this so abruptly, but we try to be strict about the time. This was fantastic. It was fascinating. It was so fun. Thank you so much for sharing your research and your knowledge with us, and for agreeing to have this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and it was really fun, and I'm looking forward to our conversation in the future. And good luck with the wonderful series. It's an amazing work and accomplishment. Thank you, Yuval. Thank you, Angie.
Yeah, thank you, Angie. And see you next time for our last lecture meeting is on May 9th, right? If I
May 9th.
Yeah, with Professor Edwin Saroussi and with the wonderful musician Ir Dalal.
And that will be the end of our series this year. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Yuval. Thank you, Roy. And thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.